Very nice to meet you. I am honored to be invited to this fantastic conference. I would like to present you to show you um, the way I see the development of Polish and Ukrainian identity, and generally the issues that come here now from this development. So as you see, the first picture is Petlura and Piłsudski standing in standing together, and this is the symbol of the Polish and Ukraine cooperation. Now, the theory of modern nation. I'd like to tell you a bit about the theory of modern nations, which is makes it easier to understand the development of Polish and national identity and Ukrainian national identity. The most important is that it treats nations not as ancient phenomena, but as phenomena that appeared recently at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, and in that aspect, Eastern and Central Europe are special because national identities developed not around the states, but first the identity appeared and later the states reappeared in Polish case, or appeared or reappeared depending on the interpretation on the Ukrainian side. So usually this is something different. This identity, modern identity, is something different from ethnicity and different from what we used to call that somebody was, usually we call it Polish language speaker, or connected with Polish culture earlier. Polish national movement and Polish national identity developed earlier. Modern national identity developed earlier, before the Ukrainian. Generally, it happened during the partitions of Poland, during that time. And of course, the great role of it was the great role of Polish different uprisings, the oppression of partitioners, and that's exactly what's happening in the process of national identification, that the oppressors play very important role, and they're usually the national identification develops in an opposition to some other factors, usually other national identity. So in Polish case, it was Russian oppression and German oppression, and mostly. Now, the Ukraine national movement and Ukrainian national identification, modern nationality started. In fact, this process got started to develop fully in the second half of the 19th century. Here we have the picture of Ivan Franko, a very famous, one of the most important Ukrainian writers and poets, and also a journalist, who is a symbol of the second part of the 19th century, and also he was taking part in the political movement. He was a radical, so-called radical. So the Ukrainian national movement developed, in fact, fully only during and after the First World War. But of course, it started earlier. And so Polish national movement, Polish national identification was better developed than Ukrainian at the end of the 19th century. Now here we have, in the Ukraine national development, we have two periods. Just shortly, the first period is the period, the so-called Kiev period. This is the first part of the 19th century. It is represented by the Cyril Methodius Brotherhood in Kiev, 1846. The brotherhood, the secret brotherhood that was established by Taras Shevchenko, Panteleimon Kulish, and Mykola Kostomarov. That was the first the organization, those people were the first to start writing, especially Taras Shevchenko, writing in Ukrainian, because earlier Ukrainian was treated as the language that is not, it shouldn't be used to writing high literature. It's just the language for of the folks. But starting from Taras Shevchenko, it has and he started writing in Ukrainian, as you can see, and Panteleimon Kulish created so-called Kulishivka, the way the language was written down. So the letters that were special letters that are used now in Ukrainian language, that that distinguish Ukrainian language from the Russian language. Now, the second period is more important. So, because for the conflict, for the Polish-Ukrainian conflict, Polish-Ukrainian relations, in the Kievan part finished when Tsars realized that Ukrainian national movement, Ukrainian development can be dangerous, and they decided to ban all the writings in Ukrainian. It happened in the 60s and 70s of the 19th century, and then Ukrainian intelligentsia migrated into Galicia. At that time, Galicia was on the part of one of the countries of Habsburg Empire, and also the part of the new entity, which was the Austro-Hungary. So Galicia, as a separate country, had its own rights and was ruled mostly by the Poles, but the freedom of development was secured by Austrian law. So it created a very good conditions for the Ukrainian development. That's why members of Ukrainian intelligentsia, influential personalities, migrated to Galicia, and one of the most important that moved to Galicia was Mikhailo Kruszewski, the most important, I think, historian in Ukrainian history, who created monumental book, History of Rus Ukraine. And in fact, who was the one who rewrote the history of Rus and so-called Ukrainian lands in this way. So this history told the story of the modern Ukraine as it is seen now. So during that time, the Galician part, we have two, in fact, most important parties, or let's say fractions. The first is Ukrainophile fraction that stated that Ukrainians are a separate nation that exists on both sides of the border, so on the so-called Polish, so Austrian side and Russian side, and they are independent, and their history go back to the Kievan Rus. And there was another fraction that was so-called Russophile and later changed into Moscowophile fraction. That was the fraction that underlined the importance of links with Russia, and also the importance of Orthodoxy. And in fact, they had the idea was that Ukraine or Galicia would be the part of Russia, and especially some of the Greek Catholic priests in Austrian part tended to move to Russian part after the liquidation of Greek Catholic Church in Russia, and they changed the religion into the Orthodox, and they became the most important people who promoted Orthodoxy among at that time Ruthenian or Ukrainian nation. So this fraction slowly but surely disappeared. They tried to create a separate artificial language that did not work, and the Ukrainophile fraction won. Also because of the support of the Polish political forces in Galicia, who ruled Galicia at the end of the 19th century, and that was the support of Polish politicians that make Michał Hruszewski come to University of Lviv, and he started there his historical school, and also he was the head of cathedral there that in fact worked on history of Ukraine. So national movement continue to develop around the ideas of Ukrainophile, Ukraine as a whole entity that having two parts, Galician and Ukraine. And some parties developed. So the most important was Ukraine National Democratic Party, that later changed into the Ukraine People's Labour Party, so-called Partia Trudowa, and 1925 in Ukraine National Democratic Alliance. So in the Second Polish Republic, the beginning of the Second Polish Republic meant the conflict with Ukrainian people. It was because the Polish and Ukrainian territories that at that time politicians imagined or saw as belonging to those two nations overlap, and of course, because it all happened not because of the conquer, as we might assume, but because of the very long history, hundreds of years of history of coexistence and living together at the same area, and that led at the end to the conflict only when the modern nationalities developed. Ukrainians during the Second Polish Republic, so in this part that was incorporated, had 5 million, it is assumed 5 million Ukrainians, that was 15% of the society, and 80% of them were peasants. But there was also Ukrainian intelligentsia that, in comparison with Stalinist Soviet Union, had quite good conditions to develop. Now, during and after the Second World War, you can see the map of the Second World War, the situation of the Polish and Ukrainian lands during the Second World War. We can see that Eastern Galicia, I mean, this is after 1941, yes? Eastern Galicia is incorporated into General Gubernatoriate, but the rest of Ukraine with Kiev is the Reichskommissariat der Ukraine. So the whole land is under the German rule, and Ukrainians under the German rule have some rights. They can, for example, publish newspapers freely, and then they use this chance to publish many things that have not been allowed during the Polish rule. But on the other hand, they are also facing the same as Poles, deportations of Ukrainian youth for the compulsory work into Germany, and also concentration camps. Also, a very brutal Holocaust is happening at the Ukrainian lands, much more brutal than even, if you can imagine that, much more brutal than in the central Poland, because Germans have no limits there, and they just very often liquidate and kill Jewish at the spot. Now, I would like to concentrate on those conflicts that are important for our today's relations. So the first, of course, is Volhynia and Eastern Galicia massacre, 1943-1944. This is the massacre of Polish population in Volhynia and Eastern Galicia. It is assessed to be the number of victims is assessed to be 100,000. But and on the Ukrainian side, it is assessed to be 5 to 10,000. But it depends on the scholar that assesses that. I generally, based on Grzegorz Motyka, I think it is the most reliable, and also his discoveries are generally accepted by the Ukrainian side, which is also important. But Ukrainians now tend to say that the number of Ukrainian victims that happened as a revenge are underestimated. But it's now difficult. I am not able now at that moment to tell you any numbers, but just giving you the brackets so that 5 to 10,000. So we know that it's not complete. We are not sure. It's just circa. Now deportations. Deportations. These pictures come from Łemkowszczyzna, from Łemkowszczyzna. This symbolize, these are the pictures of the places that from which the Ukrainian people were deported. We could probably, these are, some of them are up till now stay completely empty, and only some crosses are left. So here you have, this is from Świeżowa Valley and from Konieczna. The photos are by my husband. Now, but these deportations are, of course, after the Second World War, or during the Second World War, not only affect Ukrainians, but there were different kinds of deportations, displacing. So, as it is assessed that it was applied to about 40 million people in Europe. But of course, Ukrainians, at the end of the war, Ukrainians were supposed to be deported from the part that was supposed to belong in the future to Poland to the Soviet Union. That were 480,000. Some of them have quickly returned from the Soviet Union because they discovered that the conditions there are much worse. Then, starting from 1945, we have deportations of Poles from the Soviet Union, or we would say displacing Poles from the Soviet Union into New Poland. And that was from the Ukrainian Republic 226,000. From the total number from the whole Soviet Union of the Poles displaced was 1,843,000. Circa 1 million, almost 2 million people. Yes, almost 2 million people. And they were moved to the areas that were from which Germans were also deported or displaced. They were moved to Germany. The Vistula action was one of such deportations. It took part inside the new Polish state. There were circa 140,000 Ukrainians displaced from eastern and southern part of New Poland into the western and northern part of New Poland. So they joined those Poles that were earlier moved from the Soviet Union. And the Yalta Treaty finished with recognition of the new acquisitions of the Soviet Union. So the new border of the eastern border of Poland. And then in Potsdam, it was decided that Germans were supposed to be legally deported from Poland into Germany. But Vistula action was the initiative of the Polish communist government, and also it is it is discovered that it was also very much supported by the Soviet state and also the Soviet Union, and also they probably sent some specialists that were supposed to help, I would say, Polish communist government to put it in life. Here is the map of this Vistula action, so you can see where those Ukrainian families were transported in Poland, and those families still live there, most of them. Only some of the families returned mostly to Łemko region after 1956. So this is one of the very important factors that make nowadays immigrants from war immigrants from Ukraine feel in Poland very well, because they have very often some Ukrainian community being somewhere around. For example, in Gdańsk, this case is very strongly present in Gdańsk. Now, an independent Poland and Ukraine. We have here as a symbol of those two countries, Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine starting from 1919, and Andrzej Duda, the second, already having second candidacy presidency of Poland. And this picture was taken 2019. Now, basic facts about the Polish-Ukrainian relations after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the first relatively free parliamentary elections took part in Ukraine in 1990, and the Declaration of Independence, or so-called sovereignty, was presented in 1991. So Ukraine became the fully independent state in 1991. Poland became independent state in 1989 and earlier, and Poland was the first to formally accept the independence of Ukraine, even before Canada. So Ukrainian crisis, this is. Just at the end, I would like to tell you something about today's relations and and the Polish-Ukrainian relations in the last 30 years. So for Ukrainian in the identity, the most important were so-called Ukrainian crises. This is a kind of blueprint from the Polish month, as they call it. 2004-5, we have the Orange Revolution. This is the first such a rebel against the Russian influence, and then Viktor Yushchenko is chosen the president. Then 2010, Viktor Yanukovych is chosen a president. It's a legal process. But then 2013-14, so in November 2013 and prolonged to 2014, we have the Euromaidan and so-called the Revolution of Dignity. And the people abolish Yanukovych because he refused to accept, to sign up that Ukraine would like to be the part of the European Union. And they abolish him, and the new president is chosen 2014, Petro Poroshenko. So Ukraine fully joins these people in Ukraine fully decide about themselves, and this is also the time of a very strong development of national identification, and the national identification with Ukraine moves from the west towards the east very, very quickly during those 2 years, and then the not formal war with Russia starts. 2014, Russia in fact annexed Crimea, and there is the so-called separative states in Luhansk and Donetsk Oblasti. And then this war prolongs till now, till the Russian aggression on Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, when it's the new straightforward open war starts. But this time of the war, of the conflict with Russia, makes Ukrainian people more aware of their identity, irrespectively of the divisions in the country, which I will tell you about. Now, difficult reconciliation after 1980, sorry, this is a mistake, 1989, so after the Polish independence, in 1991, after the Ukrainian independence. This last 30 years are we can see efforts on both sides to reconcile our conflicts, our different conflicts, to solve those conflicts and to establish friend relations. And those friend relations are on the official way are established. Now, of course, it's different. The situation is much better than before. But this, from the very beginning, they were established. There were the attempts at reconciliation. There were joint statements of President of Kuchma and Kwasniewski. Then in 2003, there was a celebration in Pawłowka of massacres of Poles and joint statement on reconciliation on the anniversary of the tragic events in Volhynia. Then 2006 was the meeting of President Yushchenko and Kaczynski in Pawłowka. That was the place commemorating the massacre of Ukrainians. So we can see efforts on both sides. But at the same time, we have disputes over history. Disputes that started with New Power 2013-14 and then continued during the rule of the Law and Justice 2017-18. But for now, they have more or less finished for that moment because we have other problems that we are solving together. So reconciliation is the fraction of historical memory. So how Poles and Ukrainians differently remember the Soviet times and they form the post-Soviet narrative. And it is also the function of the interpretation of the 20th century history on both sides. But fortunately, because we really differ in the ways we see history, and what we Poles see, the most important, Ukrainians tend not to see it so important. So massacres in Volhynia and Eastern Galicia. Ukrainians tend to see UPA as the hero that fought against the Soviets. So they tend to omit those massacres or tend to not to pay too much attention to those massacres of Poles. But generally, fortunately, our relations depend mostly on the common interests. So Polish support, for examples, Polish state and Polish intellectuals, Polish politicians strongly supported Ukraine in all its crises. So, for example, during Orange Revolution, during the Revolution of Dignity, and now during the war, during the conflict with Russia. Polish government expected, I suppose, clear act of condemnation of the acts of massacre of acts of Ukrainian insurgent army in Volhynia in Eastern Galicia, 1943-1944. But I am sure that if we change focus, that can be achieved. Shouldn't be a problem. Now, complexity of Ukraine identity, just to show you. The complexity. So, for start, at the beginning, there was such an idea that there are two directions of development of Ukraine identity. That's this national Galician and the other post-Soviet. And there is also another concept of bipolarity. Galicia, Donbass on the other side, and then weak center. But this seems not to work so much now, but it still exists. Ukrainian people still tell about the differences they see each other, even now in the conflict. end of the world after history, so-called. This is revival nowadays, I mean, starting from 2014, revival of imperial post-Soviet version of Pan-Slavism, idea ruskiego mira. This is, of course, the background for today's aggression of Russia on Ukraine, and the way they see Ukrainians as not as independent nation, but as a part of the Russian nation, one of three elements of this Russian nation. So they as the Russian project says, they should be Russians, Belarusians, and Malorusians, so Ukraine. So this is still alive. Now, the concept of modern nation is still working. This is, of course, the concept, the way we interpret history, but it seems to be, this theory seems to work very well. Starting from 2014, it started working very well in the context of Ukrainian identity, because we can see that this national integration goes really very fast under the pressure of Russian aggression. The phases of pro-Western support among Ukrainians are: 1991, it was only former Galicia. 2004-5, it was to the borders of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. 2014, it moved to the whole country except Donbas, Lugansk, and Crimea, except the places that were ruled by Russians. And now it is just overwhelmed by the whole country, but there are still those differences between the Eastern and Western Ukraine in the way people speak, the language they speak, even if they speak Ukrainian, there are differences. Now, here is a map of Ukraine divided into oblasts, and you can see Donetsk and Lugansk, and you can see Crimea. This is the territory as it was before the conflict with Russia. And this is the literature that I've used. I mean, not for sure, not all, but what I can suggest for further reading. And thank you very much for your attention.